In this lecture, we will be addressing the concept of pluralism as it relates to the work of sociologists, and we'll frame this in relation to the political process, tying it very closely to the history of politics here in the United States. As Max Weber pointed out in his early works, we perceive power as either legitimate or illegitimate. Legitimate power is called authority. This is power that people accept as right. In contrast, illegitimate power is called coercion. It's power that people do not accept as just. And in our society today, even in terms of our global society, there is this ebb and flow, this give and take between authority and coercion. And we're always trying to define where we are on that kind of moving spectrum as it relates to power, authority, and violence. The government as we know it and as we relate to it, both as sociologists and as anthropologists, is the state. It claims a monopoly on legitimate force or violence, and it's through this continual threat of force and violence that government structures maintain their power. This point was made by Max Weber in his work in the early 1920s, that the state claims both the exclusive right to use violence and the right to punish, and that those under this system of power recognize that as an authoritative or authoritarian privilege of the state. And that's how the state, in a sense, is maintaining its power. Now, the other part of this argument is that the state also has to maintain its legitimacy. And very often it is usually in the state's ability to make good on its promises that establishes, in this case, a legitimate political structure and a centralized system of power. And we see this across human history. In fact, the earliest archaeological expression of power is usually symbolic, and it's usually related to, in some way, shape, or form, the state's ability to maintain the health and well being of its people, in this case, food production and resource acquisition, and in this case, providing resources to its eventual citizenry. Now, sociologist Peter Berger looked at this idea of authority and legitimate uses of violence and the establishment of power. And his very well-known work in the 1960s was summarized by the statement, "Violence is the ultimate foundation of any political power." When we look at this, we may feel that this is a bit exaggerated, that we don't experience in a day-to-day fashion this constant threat of force or this constant coercion that is the result of a threat of force. But when you take a look at how states maintain control, many of the symbols associated with that system of control, and ultimately many of the forces at work in maintaining that control, these are all things that in some way, shape, or form can be tied to violent acts, or at least the possibility of a violent act occurring. Now, sociologists recognize many different types of governments. Uh, However, all government, as a sociologist looks at it, is connected to this larger societal and social structural principle of the state and the rise of a state level system of governance. The United States political system is very unique, and we'll take a look at how its unique qualities are part of its history and ultimately its system of governance and this rise of a unique expression of citizenship. Now, when you look at the United States, one of the first things you realize is that, unlike the traditional Greek model, the United States had no city states. Each colony was its own small and independent city like structure, but there were some key principles that were missing. After the American Revolution, the colonies chose to unite. With the greater strength and resources that came from political unity, they basically pushed westward and established a very large, physically large, geographically large nation that in a sense stretched from one side of North America to the other. all of this kind of provincial area was brought under the political control of a centralized government. And this was part of the initial design. The government that was formed in this new country was labeled a democracy, coming from the Greek words demos, meaning common people, and kratos, meaning power. Democracy literally means power to the people, or power that is derived from people, the collective. Because of the bitter antagonisms that was associated with the history surrounding the American Revolution, in this case, the need to throw off an unjust king, the British king, the founders of this new country were distrustful of monarchs and monarchies. And so the other historical piece to the puzzle is that there is an inherent rejection of a autonomous, highly centralized governmental structure. And that is, again, a symbol that we can associate with monarchical rule. The founding colonies wanted to put political decisions in the hands of the people. This is not the first democracy of the world, as we know, but such a system has been tried before in smaller groups. Athens, a city-state of Greece, they practiced a kind of democracy over 2,500 years ago, with, in this case, free elections, voting, so on and so forth. Members of some Native American groups, such as the Iroquois, also had elected officials. And many say that the Iroquoian nation was a template for the early constitutional state that developed here in North America. Because of their small sizes, tribal nations and cities were able to practice direct democracy. However, the expanding United States, even the unity that was provided under the many colonies that bound together under this centralized government, it was too large to practice this form of direct democracy. Instead, the founding fathers, the principles of our constitutional government, was associated with a new brand of democracy known as representative democracy. So, as the populace of the United States was spread out, direct democracy, again, was not possible. And this new invention of democracy, this representative democracy, was something that can be tied to our unique history and our unique circumstances. Certain citizens at first voted and represented greater portions of the United States. Later, the vote was extended to wider groups. And of course, over time, it has been expanded to the many members of our pluralistic society. However, there is this electoral process which still is at the heart of this representative form of government. In this developing historical circumstance, we also have the rise of a new brand of citizenship. And again, citizenship is an ancient concept. It can be tied all the way back, at least formally, to the history of Greece and Rome. However, in the United States, there was this new brand of citizenship as it related to representative democratic principles. Today, we take the concept of citizenship for granted. What is not evident to us is that this idea had to be envisioned in the first place. It was not something that was native or natural to the human experience. There's nothing really natural about citizenship when you look at it. It is simply one way in which people choose to define themselves. Throughout most of human history, people were thought to belong to something, a larger collective, clans, tribal nations, even the ruling power of a region. However, the idea of citizenship, in this case, a virtue of birth and of residency, this is quite new as it relates to human history. So the idea that a citizen or citizenship, which you and I carry, is something that is that we are, in a sense, ascribed to, or it is something that we are born with, and that, in a sense, it is geographical in nature, And then it is also tied to the idea that there are rights or privileges that come along with that unique form of definition. This is all new relative to our history. So, representative democracy and the idea of this revolutionary age kind of citizenship that we are all now partaking of as part of our birth, as part of where we live, and as part of our everyday rights and privileges. This is new and this is unique. So, given this unique history and the construction of both representative democracy and the idea of a citizenry as it relates to that democratic process and principle, how might one define the United States political system and its relationship with this topic of pluralism? After founding the United States, numerous political parties emerged. By the time of the Civil War, two parties came to kind of dominate this political field. The Democrats, who were, in a sense, the public minded individuals, they were associated with the working class. And then the Republicans, they were associated with wealth and the generation and maintenance of wealth here in the United States. In pre elections, things called primaries, the voters decided who would represent their party. The candidate chosen by each political party then campaigned, trying to appeal to most voters, looking for, in this case, the overall public vote, but then also wanting to win over the Electoral College as part of that process, or at least be best represented within the Electoral College. The social map of the United States has changed over time, and this social map is very much part of this party system. It still, however, is predominantly localized to two parties, Democrats and Republicans. Now, today we see that Democrats and Republicans, in a sense, have very different philosophical principles. However, there are similarities. Each party appeals to a broad membership, and in a sense, they are attempting to represent the interests and issues that are important to those that they serve. The extremes that have emerged over time have, in a sense, built on the initial difference between Democrats and Republicans rather, here in the United States. Now, those who are elected to Congress have the ability to cross party lines. Party lines are not necessarily things that are rigidly codified and things that an elected official cannot consider as they are addressing a variety of issues in the United States. Some Democrats will vote for legislation proposed by Republicans and vice versa. This happens because office holders support their party's philosophy, but not necessarily specific proposals that may tie to that philosophical vision. When it comes to a particular bill, such as raising the minimum wage, some conservative Democrats may view the measure as unfair to smaller employers and vote with Republicans, or the majority of Republicans, against such a bill. At the same time, there may be liberal Republicans feeling that the proposal is just or sensing a dominant sentiment of the voters having to do with, in this case, a living wage, and they may side with their Democratic colleagues in pushing forward this particular bill. And that's just one example. Now, we're not restricted to two parties in the United States. It's just demographically and historically, two parties have had the majority of power. Third parties can exist and do exist in U.S. politics. They also support their centrist values and themes, those philosophies upon which they are established. Any party that advocates for radical change, however, is usually doomed to a short lifespan as it relates to American politics. American politics, by their nature, are fairly centralist as it relates to the entire populace or the entire voting population. So we have seen third party groups come and go. We have seen them rise in power and decline in power. Generally, those that will rise and decline in power are ones that lean away from a more centralist perspective regarding a variety of issues that are being discussed. However, when we look at how Democratic and Republican Party members behave, how they vote, how they express their views and values on the political stage, what you will find is even though we may consider individuals to be leaning to one side or the other of a particular issue, generally they fall into a larger area of consensus. So they will have a larger following with regard to a vision they may have of an aspect of the philosophy upon which the party is, in a sense, established. Well, when we take a look at these political parties, another important topic as we march toward pluralism must be addressed, which is or relates to this notion of voting patterns. So, year after year, Americans show consistent voting patterns. The idea here is that even though we may feel that our political expressions or our political ideas swing from one side of a spectrum given a subject to another, generally, historically, our voting patterns are fairly consistent. Let's look at some of these. We'll initially look at the idea of social integration. So the question we have is how can we explain these voting patterns? We look at extremes, we look at things that are more common to the majority of the voting public. How do we understand this? How does it, in a sense, connect to the many different groups and ideas that are being expressed in our society today? Well, in terms of who votes commonly, or what we see in terms of the demographics, we recognize that in this case, individuals who are Caucasian and who are of an older age, those that are of a particular educational level, and those that are employed and doing well financially, they will be more represented in a sense with regard to voting patterns. Why? Because they historically are coming out to vote on a much more regular basis. When we start looking at minority groups and we look at people who are struggling, when we recognize the poor or the unemployed, we're not seeing as much of an input with regard to patterns, voting patterns in the United States. And this is something that pluralism as a principle is going to push back against. And we have seen this change over the past few voting periods. The idea that more people are getting out and more people are making sure that they are uh, voting on particular issues and that they are exercising their inalienable right as a citizen of this representative democracy. However, what we find is that as we begin to be more socially integrated in terms of the vote and it starts to represent more of our pluralistic society, the patterns having to do with more turnout at particular times of the year are still driven by issues more than being driven by this notion of my responsibility as a member of this American community. So that's another thing that many of the social movements that we addressed in our last lecture, many of them are focusing on this idea of getting the vote out, no matter what time of year and what topic is being addressed. So in terms of alienation and apathy, how does this all happen? Those who gain less from a system generally will be or feel more alienated, and it can lead to apathy in relation to a process like voting. So individuals who feel that they do not have a voice in terms of their ability to acquire a particular level of education or income or employment will begin to trend away from this voting pattern that we're hoping for with regard to everyone's voice being heard in this process. Some voters feel betrayed, believing that politicians have sold out to special interest groups, and they are convinced that all politicians are liars in some way, shape, or form. This can also affect voting patterns, as you can imagine. Minorities who feel that the United States system is a system that is expressing white power, or this notion of whiteness that we discussed and that we addressed in Dr. Better's primer, they also will generally express more apathy as a result and as it relates to the voting process. So when people do not vote because of vote apathy or indifference, this becomes an extreme issue in our society today, because the idea here is that their input in the political process is not there. Also, in terms of voting patterns and this notion of citizenship, issues having to do with gender and race or ethnicity are also factors that must be addressed when we're taking a look at people's involvement in the political process and how this representative democracy is truly representing its populace. Historically, men and women voted the same way in the United States, but there is a political gender gap that has become more well defined in recent decades. When one goes to the poll, there is a difference, in a sense, today in terms of how the majority of men and women vote and the political candidates that they support. Men, in this case, appear to be more likely to favor Republican candidates, while women, as a majority, are more likely to vote for Democratic candidates. At least that's what we are seeing in terms of the two-party presidential split today in the kind of the post-voting kinds of censuses that are being taken. This same kind of break or difference in the majority of votes that are being presented as it relates to ethnicity also will start to break across party lines. Historically, African Americans have voted for Democratic Party candidates more than they have for Republican presidential candidates and political representatives. So voting patterns, in a sense, have become much more akin to major philosophical divides between the pluralistic patterns within the United States today. And it is this voter turnout and the kind of the census that is taken after the vote that is helping us to better understand this divide that exists within the United States. Uh, Asian Americans, those that represent a wide variety of ethnicities associated with the Asian Pacific and Asian regions within our global society. They have been an exception to some of the patterns that we have seen. Today in the United States, Asian American subcultures will generally express their voting in a much more Republican than Democrat kind of majority versus minority kind of situation. So the idea here is that we are seeing kind of the flip expression of this voting pattern. Now, these voting patterns, though, and it's important to emphasize this, are not hardwired. These aren't inevitable outcomes. In coming decades, you may see a reversal of these trends. But the idea here is that when we're talking about social integration in the United States, voting patterns are a very good resource for understanding the divides that exist between particular kinds of issues among populations and subcultures. So the idea here is that as people start to align themselves in certain ways as it relates to issues that the politics will hyper express, we are starting to see a divide in perspective as it relates to gender, as it relates to ethnicity, as it relates to race. And so this has been important for sociologists to be able to understand the particular issues that are important to sections of our society today. Lobbyists and special interests and special interest groups are another important topic when we're looking at voting patterns and what might be pushing against or supporting social integration as it relates to the voting process. These are public, non-political organizations, nonprofit organizations that will develop around specific issues that they believe to be important to their constituents, to their industry, and they will advocate for that financially. They will, in a sense, organize social movements around it. And these are pretty effective resources within the American political system today. And people lie on either side of this subject as it relates to lobbyists and special interest groups, whether they are good for the political system or that they are in some way, shape, or form bad for the this notion of a representative democracy. So, what are these things? So, a special interest group consists of people who think alike on a particular issue and who can be mobilized, in this case, for political action. So, they have an issue, they think alike regarding that issue in terms of majority within that group and how we define it. And then they can be mobilized, in a sense, for that process of a political action. The dairy industry is a very good example of this. This consists of thousands of individuals who then have an interest in this particular industry within the United States, many of them dairy farmers, and they support legislation then that ultimately enhances their market and allows them to compete equally within that fair market environment. There's a very fine line then between a special interest group and individual lobbyists. Now, lobbyists are generally people who are paid to influence legislation on behalf of their clientele. And their clientele may be a special interest group, or it may be a very wealthy individual. Lobbyists, in a sense, are individuals, whereas special interest groups, of course, are collectives. Lobbyists may not or do not have to necessarily support an issue or have an opinion on a particular issue. They are, in a sense, paid to influence the voting process as it relates to people in Congress and, of course, even the executive branch itself. So then what does all of this have to do with the topic of pluralism? Well, pluralism, in a sense, is kind of the gasoline for the entire process. When you think about a representative democracy like the United States and the topic or principle of citizenship, these are all things that tie into pluralistic values and the idea of a pluralistic society, the idea of representation of the people is a concept that is very much founded in a pluralistic philosophy. Functionalists, social theorists that consider the function of a particular phenomenon, they view the state as having arisen out of the basic needs of people, and specifically social groups. This idea of looking at the state as a people-led structure and one that was designed to protect people and groups from oppression or the overexpression of power in one location within a society or another. This is very much of a functionalist view of what the state does. The fear is that when you have a monopoly on violence and power, and it is the state that monopolizes that power, there is a risk. The risk is that the state can turn that threat of force against its own citizens. Now, what's the response and where does pluralism fit into all of that? Well, the United States, what keeps the United States government from turning against its citizens is this notion of pluralism. Functionalists will say that pluralism, a diffusion of power in a sense among many special interest groups, prevents any one group from gaining control of the government and using it to oppress others. So pluralism as a process diffuses the power and prevents any one group, political or otherwise, to have greater representation. So the function of pluralism, and specifically pluralism as it relates to the United States, is this exact thing. It's this idea of not allowing a centralized expression of government to overrepresent one group or another. So to keep the government from coming, in a sense, under the control of any one group, the founders of the United States set up three branches of government: an executive branch, the president, a judicial or judiciary branch, the courts, and then a legislative branch, the Senate and the House, and the representatives therein. Each of these members of the government, each of these branches in a sense, is sworn to uphold the Constitution of the government, which guarantees the rights of citizens, and each in a sense can nullify the actions of the other two. This system, known as a system of checks and balances, was designed to ensure that no one branch of government could dominate the others. So it's a kind of a two-tier approach. The idea that yes, we'll accept centralized power, we'll accept political authority. However, we want to make sure that it is equally distributed and that it is truly representative of the people that it oversees, in a sense. And then, as part of that two-tier approach, within that power structure, sections of the power structure are also checking and balancing against one another, and that's very, very powerful. Our pluralistic society then has many parts. There are men, there are women, there are different ethnic groups, there are different racial groups, there are socioeconomic populations, there are faith-based populations, and all of these groups, in a sense, want equal representation under the law, and our system of government does that by design. No group, in theory, can dominate. Rather, each group pursues its own interests. It is balanced, in a sense, by other groups pursuing their own interests. And in a sense, there is this kind of negotiation, one with the other, making compromises and developing legislation that will, in a sense, meet some or most of the interests and issues that each group has. Politicians then try to design policies that please as many people within these populations, within these groups, as they can. So functionalists, in a sense, recognize our political system as a response to the people and not a one group kind of policy. It's a multi-group policy, a pluralistic policy. However, as we have seen through looking more closely at Dr. Better's argument, there are a variety of structural pieces to how the society is built that, in a sense, are pushing back against this more pluralistic value in our political system and in our political landscape. The idea here is that when we look at social movements, when we look at processes of social change and the strategies involved in exacting those processes of social change, we have to understand that all pieces within that structural framework have to align themselves, that an individual or a group may have better representation politically, but is their quality of life and their ability to have equal access economically to particular kinds of resource the same, right? Do they align themselves? Or their ability to be a part of the production process or the wealth building process, is that too expressed in an equal fashion? And that's the real challenge within this American system and within this American experiment, if you want to look at it that way. The idea that it is chiefly a political design, but it is something that strives to take this political philosophy and impose it back upon social and economic structures within the larger society.